What's going on, guys? Our rivaling teacher in the house, and welcome back to another RGBL breakdown. In the last video, I broke down my own draft and gave you my thoughts on it. And this time, we are going to be looking at my opponent's drafts. We'll give my thoughts on them and what we are looking at, and sort of my thoughts on my matchup against them. I'm not going to give too much away on my own, obviously. But yep, if you like this draft league content coming back, make sure to show support by leaving a like and subscribe as always. But without any further ado, let's jump on into it. Also, shoutouts to Pokemon Master 3556 for the Darklet I'm actually using for this. They're very kind enough to post it in the chat, and it gives us a few extra things to work with. Just a quick side note before we get into it, the moves on the bottom right can be slightly inaccurate, but I will go through those as and when. But yeah, without any further ado, let's jump on in and have a look at these teams. So, first pick on the draft was the Snivy Fraser University and Coach Teddy. He drafted a very, very powerful team. I have to say it, this team is super exciting to watch. Especially when you look at things like the Iron Valiant and Jirachi Salamence. It's a very, very powerful Fairy Dragon Steel Core. Valiant, of course, being one of the best ones in the draft, especially after boost of speed. It can be physical or special, it's very versatile. Jirachi, of course, being a very solid, versatile mon, can be bulky, can be offensive, can do a lot of different things, much like things like all the base 100 mythicals. They're kind of very similar in that sense. And Salamence is a decent dragon, a very solid option, Intimidate Moxie. Can be bulky support, can be Dragon Dance, and all sorts of various things like that. Definitely provides a very strong start to the team and took advantage of the early wheel pick really well. Love Rotom Wash as a bulky water and a pivot. I think it's one of the most solid bulky water pivots we have in the format. Alolan Muck was a great pickup. I'm annoyed at him for picking that, to be honest, because I was considering that as well if I didn't opt for Chikauji. But Alolan Muck's a solid Toxic Spike Absorber, which we definitely need in this, because sadly Alolan Muck does not get Toxic Spikes. That's one thing I did notice when I was having a look in prep for this. However, regular Muck does, funnily enough. Chandelure, really strong special attacker. It's a good spin blocker as well. Gets a very solid ability for Flame Body as well as a good immunity. I forgot it got Infiltrator, by the way. I completely didn't realize it got that, but this is really good against screens and subsetters. Obviously, Chandelure, the one thing it does have that's not great against it is its very low speed tier. Well, I say very low. It's a very middling speed tier. Yeah, but that being said, there is a couple of Tailwind setters on this team, notably the Salamence as well as the Vespiquen, which is pretty valuable on this team as is. There's no web support on this. Unfortunately, Vespiquen does not get webs. I don't actually know if Daddy knew that when he drafted it, but yeah, Vespiquen does not get webs, but does get spikes and T-spikes though, so it can be pretty interesting. Serena is one of the better spinners. I'm quite a fan of Serena as a spinner. Obviously, Queely Majesty is a really good ability as well to block priority, so you can't revenge kill it, which is pretty nice. Nice. Being a spinner is kind of important. It gets things like U-turn and knockoff, which are both really solid. It moves for it to have. Things like play rough for coverage can really start putting in the hurt as well, which is really good to have. It's a decent enough mon. It's very bulky. It's got a great attack stat with that base 120. The 98 defense and SPDF definitely makes it a little bit tricky to kill. Albeit its HP at 72 is not the greatest. But as a spinner, it's extremely strong. So definitely a good offensive option. Didn't choose to Terra it, which I was a little surprised to see. I thought Terra Serena would be an interesting option. In fact, I'm not actually sure if it was banned, because it's very good. If it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't banned. It wasn't banned from Terra, so decent enough, but either way. Dugtrio was an interesting pick to me. It is a good ground type. Obviously, that 120 base speed and that 100 attack is definitely he's something you would pick it for. One thing that is worth noting is if Smogon Causelors are in play, which I believe I saw in the rules in the dark, Arena Trap would be banned. So if he was trying to use it for Trap, that's probably not the correct decision, so it would be forced to use Sandveil or Sandforce. That being said, it's very speedy rocks. It does get Stealth Rock, which is very, very nice. Nice, can be very good on this team. It is very, very frail with 35 HP, 50 attack, and 70 SPDF. It's gonna die very quickly. So I could see like a Sash lead set, get your rocks up, maybe fire off an Earthquake. or something like that. I believe it gets Sucker Punch as well. So it can run things like that. But yeah, Dugtrio, if he was hoping to use it as a trapping option, I'm pretty sure trap is banned. Derek, I know you watch these videos. If you can confirm that down in the comments, that would be appreciated. Mousehold is one of his Terra captains. I loved this pick, by the way. Mousehold was on my radar for a little while, but I opted not to go for it. Tidy Up is fantastic removal, which is really, really solid. Obviously, given the speed and attack boost as well. With access to Technician Population Bomb, this thing does a ton of damage. It is absurd how good this thing is. Obviously, it can be telegraphed. Just bring a physically bulky mon with Rocky Helmet can be the element of surprise. But with decent Terra Captains of normal Dark and Ghost, I think this could be very effective. Obviously, Ghost is really strong because you can avoid getting faked out, which is pretty useful. You would full foul a Sucker Punch, but you can work around that. Terra Dark was an interesting choice. I'm not quite sure why he went for that. Maybe just needed another type. Although Mousehold does get knockoff, so... Well, no, it doesn't get knockoff. But it does get a decent amount. It is also a pivot with access to U-turns, so could work in his favor. Hisuian Avalugg, this is a pick that I had at the back end of last season of the RGBL. Unfortunately, we didn't have Terra at the time, so I couldn't really make use of it myself, but I'm interested to see how Teddy uses it. With Ice Body, Strongjaw, and Sturdy, it's got decent ability. Strongjaw will probably be the most likely one that it goes for, because there's not really the support for Ice Body. Albeit Sturdy is a thing. I did actually bring a tech at the back end of last season. Unfortunately, I didn't get to bring it off, but I did run Sturdy Miracle at one point, which was pretty interesting. But yeah, if we look at the actual moves and the options, you've got two rockers, which are Jirachi and Dugtrio. Vespiquen bringing spikes and toxic spikes. The one thing I will say is all of these defoggers that are on the dock no longer get defog. So there is actually no defoggers on this team at all. It is two spinners in the Serena and the Hisuian Avalugg, and then obviously Tidy Up from Mousehold, which is fine. We got some okay U-turners here, especially Jirachi, Mousehold, Serena, decent pivots. Vespiquen, probably not the best access to U-turn, to be honest. Volt switching, obviously, with Rotom, which is pretty nice. I don't think anything on this team gets Parting Shot. In fact, I can actually look that up. If anyone of this team gets Parting Shot. No, none of them do. Didn't think so. But, it's a pretty interesting team. Obviously, there's a good few Trick Mons. Trick Rotom Wash can be interesting, sort of Trick Lagging Tail. That could be a thing that I could see. Electric Terrain as well is something I kept on there. This was actually originally on there for other reasons, but Electric Terrain could be fascinating for Valiant. To give it a Quark Drive boost. Now, I did note that there are some Trick Room options, but to be honest, I don't think Trick Room is really going to feature on this team. Yes, okay, there is, like, Avalugg, Hisui, and, you know, potential Chandelure, but Chandelure not being the slowest thing in the world probably isn't going to take advantage of Trick Room all that well. But there are two Tailwind setters. Salamence with Tailwind could actually be very important, because Salamence and Iron Valiant under Tailwind, and Mousehold, actually, and Jirachi can all outspeed Regieleki under Tailwind, so definitely worth noting that, especially as Regieleki did get drafted. But I think this is a very, very strong team. This has got a decent balance of pace. We've got some fast mons in the Dugtrio and the Valiant and the Mousehold. We've got some decent sort of mid-speeds with Jirachi, Salamence, Rotomosh, and Chandelure. And to an extent, Serena. Serena's a little on the slower end. And then we've got decent slow-paced mons that all have a decent role on the team with Alolan Vespiquen, and Avalugg. We've got decent on the physical side, both offensively and defensively. Slightly less on the special side, which might be punishable, especially teams that have got really good special offense. This might be an area you might want to try to exploit with this team. But priority is going to be important, and obviously Serena can block priority with Queenly Majesty, but the option is there. I think this is a very, very scary team. This is probably one of the hardest teams in the league to play against. So I'm excited for this matchup when it comes out. But yeah, very excited to see these matchups. Obviously, Terra Captains, Mousehold makes the most sense. Hisuian Avalugg with Ice Fairy Water is not bad at all. I don't really get the Fairy option, personally, considering it's still weak to Steel, which Avalugg is quad weak to. I would like to have seen, like, fire on this instead. Water is also a good option. Vespiquen, I don't think Teddy's ever towering, but Flying Fairy and Fighting seems to be okay. Well, I was looking at. Right, let's talk about I believe this is just called Team J at the moment, so I don't think J has a team name. Though actually, I am just having a look, just to double check that, because I'm pretty sure there was a team name. Yeah, the Newark Noctowls is Jay's team. That's a really fascinating team. Now, Jay actually did, just before I started recording, make 4 transactions to this team that completely changes how this team looks. So we'll go through the team as it is now, and I'll talk about the Pokemon that were on the team, because there was one pick that I was very surprised to see get dropped. But we will talk about it. So Dragapult, it's Dragapult. We don't need to say too much about it. It's one of the fastest Pokemon in the game. It's one of the most versatile Pokemon in the game as well. With 3 probably the best ability combinations you could probably ask for. Clear Body preventing stat drops, Infiltrator being able to break screens and sub, and Curse Body to be able to lock down certain important moves. All really, really strong in terms of ability basis. So this offers so much to any team. And being able to build a team around this is crazy good. Corviknight, one of the best defoggers in my opinion. There's not that many defoggers that are very strong in the format. I think Corviknight definitely offers the most value, which is definitely good to see. Obviously Pressure is also nice, and Mirror Armor is really cool tech as well. You can bounce back Intimidates and other stat drops, things like that. But I think Pressure to be able to stall out opposing moves is very, very scary. Couple that with a very solid amount of physical bulk. That 105 physical defense is nothing to sneeze at. With 98 HP and 85 Spadef, this is a really good bulky mon. It gets access to U-turn as well, so really solid for pivoting purposes. But you're gonna just run Boots Corviknight with like Defog Roost. And even just things like Body Press could be very, very problematic for a lot of teams to deal with. Iron Moth, I was very happy to see this get picked up, mainly because it sniped mate. Sorry, mate, but it was pretty funny. Because I took your Heatran off you, and then Jay took the Iron Moth immediately, which was pretty nice. It's a grounded poison type, which is always good. Gets Toxic Spikes of its own. Can hit very, very hard. It's got a really high special attack stat to operate with that 140, which is nuts, and a good speed tier 2 at 110, so you definitely can write this thing off. It gets a myriad of coverage moves, does get U-turn for pivoting as well, which is nice. But yeah, this thing's a good offensive breaker. Unfortunately, obviously, just like most of the Paradox Pokemon, it doesn't get Quiver Dance or anything like that. The Volk does. But this thing hits very, very hard. It pairs up very nicely with things like the Pult, because it takes on the fairies that Dragapult doesn't want to deal with, much like Corviknight. Florges is an interesting pickup. Unfortunately, contrary to this doc's belief, it doesn't actually get defog anymore, and it also lost its signature cleric move, which was Aromatherapy. Every Pokemon in the game lost Aromatherapy, except, weirdly enough, Calyrex Ice Rider still has it, but no other Pokemon in the game has it, so that can be a little bit of a bind. You know, things like Dragapult and Corviknight getting burned definitely sucks. Same with Weavile, we'll talk about later on, as well as Hisuian Decidueye. Getting those burned and not being able to clear them off definitely sucks. But Florges is still bulky, it's a decent Wish Passer. It has a lot of special bulk to operate with, so it can still be good. But as fairies go, I'm not sure I rate Florges that much anymore, given the fact it lost, you know, the 2 reasons you would draft it, in my opinion, which is Defog and Aromatherapy. Gastrodon is a nice Pokemon. It's been slowly buffed over time. It now actually gets Spikes and Stealth Rocks, which is something it didn't used to get. Which is decent. It only has 1 weakness as well as an immunity to water thanks to having Storm Drain. It's a very, very solid Pokemon. It's a bulky water. We love bulky waters in draft. It's very commonplace. So definitely a good fit for this team. Grabbing a bulky water when you've got a really powerful offensive fire definitely helps. And a decent grass type pickup at the end. We'll talk about the Hisuian Decidueye in a bit. Galarian Articuno is a mon I don't actually know that much about, to be honest with you. I've sort of seen it around briefly in like lower tier format. I know it's a special attacker that's got a decent speed tier, that 95 speed. but I don't really know too much about what it does. It does get Freezing Glare, and I should know it can be pretty nasty. As a decent mon. It doesn't get Defog, unfortunately, which kind of sucks for it. But he did make it a Terra Captain of Psychic, Fighting, and Ground. I think those are interesting choices. We have to choose a stab, so Psychic definitely makes a lot of sense. Could have just chosen Flying. I think Flying is also fine. But I think Psychic to boost up those Freezing Glares to make them a little bit more scary is good. Fighting obviously is to counter the Dark types. I probably would have considered Fairy over Fighting. I think Fighting as a defensive Terra is not the best. Because Fighting essentially makes you weak to Flying, which kind of makes you weak to yourself, which is never ideal. And Ground is an interesting choice to deal with electric types. I can see that. It does have Competitive, which is a really great ability, especially if you can Terror it away. You can actually switch this in on Webs, lose your speed, and then gain a special attack boost, which is pretty nice for sweeping offensively, if you can get it in the right position. But we shall see if that is a possibility. Vikavolt is a really solid pickup. Vikavolt does a lot of work. It's obviously an electric type with Levitate, which is very nice. Also, the other Terra Captain, and with Electric, Steel, and Water as its Terra choices. Electric makes absolute sense. You know, making it pure electric with Levitate means it has no weaknesses, which is definitely the best offensively. Steel is a decent choice. You are still weak to fire, though. But Water obviously makes a lot of sense, too. Because you can actually just sponge a lot of the hits from Water type. I don't actually think it gets any Water moves to buffer up, but defensively it's not a bad typing because you remove your weakness to fire, which could be a problem, especially as there's a lot of really strong offensive fires in the format. But let's talk about the picked up Pokemon. So originally on this team, there was Alolan Persian, Garganical, Abomasnow, and Ambipom, which, I'll be honest, I don't agree with all of these changes. I would have kept Ambipom myself, but we'll go through what is here. So, Wigglytuff is a solid low-tier fairy. Now, it does get Wish, much like Florges does. It can Baton Pass, much like Florges does, but obviously it has competitive, so you can run it offensively. Frisk is an underrated ability too, by the way. I think Frisk is actually really solid, being able to scout your opponent's items. It's very nice in singles. It's not as good in VGC, obviously, because it's an open team sheet. But it does get a bunch of coverage moves. It's bulky enough that you can operate it with a huge HP stat. But it doesn't really offer anything offensively, in all honesty. You do need the competitive boost to be useful with Wigglytuff. So I'm not really sure why this was picked up over Ambipom. I probably would have just kept Ambipom, if I'm being honest. Weavile was a good pickup, though, in my opinion. Weavile offers a bit of extra pace. This team had decent enough pace, but it was slightly slow with the inclusion of Alolan Persian, Abomasnow. Garganicle's not very quick. Ambipom was obviously the quicker of the mons that did get dropped. Weavile offers a ton of pressure, no pun intended because of its ability, obviously. It's very quick offensively. It gets a myriad of coverage moves, which is very, very scary on this thing. It can Baton Pass, but I really doubt it's ever going to get used. It's got very spammable knockoffs, which can put in a decent amount of work. It does get Ice Shard for priority. It does not get Sucker Punch, however, so that's something to bear in mind. Obviously, that quad weakness to fighting can be a problem, and it can't terrestrialize. So it could be interesting. Overquill gives an extra Spike Setter and a T-Spike Setter, but it doesn't really offer anything else other than that, and there was already Spikes and T-Spikes on the team. But I think as an Intimidate option, it's not a bad choice. Giving an extra Intimidate could be decent. Does get Taunt as well, which could be useful. But I don't feel like Overquill is the best addition to the team. It does give him some extra physical power. Can be decent offensively, to be honest. With T-Spikes and Intimidate, it's a decent bulky mono as well. I don't know. I think Overquill's fine. It's a decent Pokemon, but I don't really see what it brings to this team that, you know, something like an Iron Moth doesn't already bring, personally. And Hisuian Decidueye is an extra defogger for the team, which is nice. Obviously not a Terra Captain, unfortunately. I think this thing with Terra is actually really strong. But obviously, Jay opted for Vikavolt instead. But yeah, obviously Triple Arrow is extremely powerful, especially with the Scrappy ability. It can hit through Ghosts, which is nuts. It does have some decent moves. It's a defogger. It is slow, though. So it would kind of benefit a lot from Webs or Tailwind. I don't know if there's actually Tailwind on this team. Let's have a quick look. If there is Tailwind on this team, then this will work a lot better. I didn't want Dragon Tail. Let's have a quick shifty at Tailwind. We'll just pop this in. Yeah, 3 Tailwind setters. Corviknight I don't think can afford to run it, to be honest, but I do think Galarian Articuno, and I didn't actually realize this Nidorai got Tailwind itself. But that's interesting, so it does have Tailwind setters to work with, which could make this team extremely nasty to deal with under Tailwind conditions. A lot of these slightly slower mons could become potent, but it's a case of having to set up Tailwind, and who's going to set it up? I guess Galarian Articuno would be the best option, because Corviknight can't really afford to run out its moveset, unless it's, like, not doing any damage. And I don't think the Decidueye is going to last long enough to be able to use it, unless you run, like, Sash. Which I could see Sash being ran on it, but it is just so slow, it can get picked off very quickly by good offensive mons. So I'm not super convinced it will get run, but this is a decent Tailwind offensive team. Offensively, it does very nicely on both sides. It's got good special attack and attack on its stats. Defensively, it's not bad. It's got a decent speed tier average, so I think this is a decently well-rounded team. It certainly could be threatening to play against. I'm just not convinced by a couple of the pickups. I think Ambipom should have stayed on the team. Garganical was a surprising drop as well. I'm a huge fan of Garganical, to be honest. So I would have liked to have seen that on this team. But nonetheless, I'm not Jay. I don't make that decision. But yeah, very interesting team nonetheless. Going to be a challenging team to play against. All right then. So now next up is Mate, who obviously is annoyed with me because I took his Heatran. But yeah, Mate's team, the Goodnight Cresselia team. I actually like this team a lot. I think this team's got a lot of potential. There are certain things that I would be a little bit concerned by in this instance. Obviously, Annihilate's a phenomenal first pick. It makes so much sense to pick this. It's very, very powerful. It's got great stats. It works very, very well in just about any team. So I think Annihilate works well. Just having access to Defiant as well can deter a lot of like web setters and things like that. So obviously Annihilate changes the way you have to play the game, because you don't want to give Annihilate that's already very powerful a boost. So that's something to bear in mind. I think Baxcalibur was an interesting choice to pair with it. Obviously both mons are weak to Fairy, which is something to bear in mind. So I think this could be scary. Obviously, Baxcalibur providing a fire immunity of sorts with that thermal exchange, giving it an attack boost if it gets hit by one, could make it a very interesting pivot option. I think it's got some attractive options in that regard. Baxcalibur obviously does a ton of work offensively with 145 attack. It's definitely got a lot going for it. It couldn't really put in her. It's got a great amount of coverage moves. It's a little bit unfortunate that it can't Terra, but it would be absolutely broken if it could Terra. So we're definitely not going to worry about that. Monkey Dory, I think, is underrated. As a member of the Loyal 3, it's got good pace and really good special attack. It does have access to Fake Out and Parting Shot, which has got a few things going for it. Obviously, the Toxic Chain ability is very, very nice, being able to spread poison. You can do that 30% of the time on a switching for free with a Fake Out. Which could be nice. Frisk, again, I've talked about Frisk being a solid ability in general. I like this as an option. It is very, very frail, however, and obviously Poison Psychic is not the best typing in the world. So it could still run into a lot of issues, but I think it's a really interesting choice to pick up. It's a grounded poison. We always like grounded poison to get rid of Toxic Spikes. It doesn't, however, have Toxic Spikes of its own, which is a little bit of a shame. Torterra as a Terra captain makes a lot of sense. It was drafted in the SBL. It's a very, very solid Terra. Ground, Water, Fire, I believe, is actually what the coach, I think it's Pokemon deal, it's got it. Also pick those 3 Terra types. Ground is a really strong one. Those Earthquakes are really going to start hurting, especially after a Shell Smash, which it got this gen. Water is nice because it cuts away that Fire and Ice weakness, especially the Ice being quad weakness is definitely an issue. And Fire, of course, offers a good amount offensively. Especially as it wipes away things like the flying weakness as well. as well as hitting back against those ice types that it otherwise couldn't really hit that well. I think it's a very, very solid option. Getting Shell Smash definitely helps. It is, however, base 56 speed, though, so even after a Shell Smash, it's actually outsped by a lot of Pokemon, even without speed options. I think Iron Bundle still outspeeds it, and in and around that sort of speed tier definitely still outspeeds this thing after a Shell Smash. So could be interesting to play around, but it's a really strong Terra Captain nonetheless. Milotic is a solid bulky water. Obviously, Marvel Scale makes it even bulkier, and competitive could be good against webs. So if you wanted to run this thing offensively, you could. Getting Scald back is really, really nice. It does get access to Refresh. So it can be pretty interesting to use. I think it's got a lot going for it. A bulky water is always nice in draft. Having a good pivot definitely makes a lot of sense. Moltres. Now, unfortunately, Moltres lost Defog, which means that essentially it needs heavy-duty boots to stay alive, and it can't actually remove the rocks. So that's one thing to keep in mind, mate, is it doesn't have rocks at all. Flame Body is still nice, though, especially if you switch it in on a physical attacker. Being able to cripple it with a burn is really nice. But Moltres is fine. I mean, offensively, it's got decent bulk, too, to be honest, for a legendary bird. It's not too bad a pick. It does offer a decent amount. Offensively, it's fine, but I do worry that this thing's going to offer very little to a team, especially as it doesn't have Defog anymore. Klefki is also another Pokemon that lost Defog. In fact, Klefki only had Defog in Generation 7 as a tutor move in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. It has never had Defog since. So this thing still is bulky, though. It does still get spikes. Gets screens. So it can be okay. Prankster obviously is very nice. Magician doesn't offer too much on Klefki, to be honest. It's much more of a Delphox thing. But yeah, as a bulky support option, definitely nice. Doesn't get a lot of pivoting moves. I do think it gets Baton Pass, though. If I remember right. Oh, no, it doesn't, actually. That actually surprises me. But yeah, as Prank, it's a Supportmon, gets Thunder Wave, gets a decent amount of utility. So it's bulky utility for the team. As a Steel type, it definitely makes sense. Braviary being the other Terra Captain, obviously another Defiant Pokemon, which is pretty nice. However, it's a Flying type, so it doesn't necessarily benefit against webs. It does get Sheer Force as an ability too, which is very strong. Terra choices were Flying, Fairy, and Electric. Obviously, Flying makes more sense than normal for Stab, because flying access to Brave Bird does a lot of damage. Fairy is an interesting choice. I did have a look at Fairy to see if it does get things like Play Rough or anything. It doesn't. And obviously, Electric removes that Electric weakness, etc. Which is a pretty interesting type choice. I think it's a strong Terra Captain. I definitely can see it doing a ton of work. Life Orb Sheer Force is always a very powerful combination. Does get Tailwind as well for support, much like Moltres does, which could allow things like the Annihilate and the Baxcalibur that maybe don't quite have the speed that it wants just to be able to get through over the line. Regieleki, of course, by it being on the team, changes the way people build. Because obviously that 200 speed tier is absolutely nuts, which means that things that might not want to run Scarf have to run Scarf to be able to outrun it, or just run like a lot of special bulk. Transistor did sadly get nerfed, so it's not as good as it used to be. It's still strong though. Things like Electro Web for speed control is very nice. Obviously, Volt Switch for pivoting is really good. It is a spinner as well. So entry hazards can be a thing. It does get access to screens. So it's got a few things going for it that I think is really strong. It's not allowed to Terra, sadly, so no Terra Ice to be able to run through the ground types. But it does get some normal moves that it can abuse anyway, so that's totally fine. Ditto is obviously Ditto. We all know what Ditto does. It copies the opponent. Now, the one thing I'm surprised at in this league is that Ditto was allowed to Terra. That's one thing that surprises me, because you can copy like you can copy a high tier mon and then terrestrialize it. But I guess it would be difficult to use that anyway, because you'd still have to specifically pick 3 Terra for your Terra Captains, and you may not necessarily know what you want to terrestrialize into. So it could be a little bit too difficult to use. But nonetheless, Ditto is Ditto. Cricketune, it's a 1-point mon. It doesn't offer too much. It is a web setter, but that's pretty much all it has. It's web's knockoff, Baton Pass, that's pretty much it. It doesn't really offer too much, but as a web setter, it exists. But to be honest, it's going to die before it really does anything. It's very, very poor defensively with 77 HP, 51 in both defenses. Yeah, this thing's just going to get bodied before it even gets a web set up, unless it's Focus Sash. And if you really want to commit a Focus Sash Cricketune to a battle, I think you're probably asking for trouble. My Bostiff was a pretty interesting pick. I was surprised to see this get picked up at first, but I actually really like it. Gets a lot of coverage moves, and Intimidate and Guard Dog are both very, very good abilities. Something that I've seen, obviously Guard Dog on Okie Dokie is really strong, but it's a solid mon in general. It gets decent Dark type moves, it gets decent coverage moves. So I can see this thing being really good on this team. It's a little bit lacking in speed, but it can take advantage of Webs or Tailwind, whichever goes for now. But looking at hazards, there's no Toxic Spikes on the team, which is a little bit sad. But obviously the removal options is limited because Moltres and Klefki no longer get defog, so it is just Braviary, which may not really want to run it. Because you probably want to run it more offensively, so your main removal is going to be Rapid Spin on Regieleki, which is still a really solid option, to be fair. It's fast, it can pretty much guarantee a spin. No problem in singles format, so yeah, definitely nice. Plenty of U-turn options. I don't think Monkey Dory is going to run it, but Moltres, Braviary, and Annihilate probably certainly will. And one Volt Switcher. Could be interesting. Obviously, the main priorities are going to be Tailwind. If you want to run Tailwind options to be able to get your speed up, that's probably going to be where it looks. Right, so my team, I'm not going to go over too much because obviously I've done my own breakdown on this, but general feeling is I've got plenty of things all over the place. I've got plenty of hazards, I've got decent enough removal. Some pretty solid pivots and some flexible options because all of my offensive threats, particularly Manaphy, Heatran, and Thundy T are quite flexible offensively. They can be special or physical. So I was initially concerned that I was too specially offensive when I drafted this thing. But in general, not the bulkiest team I've ever drafted, but it's very good offensively, so I think I've got pretty solid choices across the board. Right, next up is going to be the Clockwork and the KC Kingdras. I like this team a lot. As a Sun core, and with a Sun team of things like the Walking Wake, Prankster Sunny Day on Thundy Eye, and Ninetales, I think it's a really, really strong Sun core with a decent rock type in Diancie that may not necessarily offer too much offensively, but defensively this thing is phenomenal. So I think this is a well-rounded Sun core with a lot of decent components around it. Obviously Okie Dokie being your grounded poison to get rid of the Toxic Spikes is very nice, alongside having Guard Dog as an ability which blocks Intimidate. This thing is actually nuts, by the way. It's got insane attack and defense, and having Guard Dog to be able to block Intimidate is really, really strong, as well as access to Bulk Up. Walking Wake got Scold and Flip Turn, so it actually becomes very potent in and out of Sun. So what I kind of like about the way this draft has been structured is that this team can function both in and out of Sun. Obviously, Torn lost Defog, Rotom lost Defog, so the only Defogger on this team is Decidueye, and Donphan is a spinner, so could be a problem dealing with hazards. You probably have to run Boots on quite a few things that you may not run Boots on. But it's fine. I think it's a really decent team. It's not the fastest team in the world, has to be said, and there is no webs on the team. I'm not sure if there's Tailwind as well. I don't remember if Thundy still has Tailwind. Decidueye has it though, so he could run Tailwind Decidueye with some of these mons to just make the slow mons a little bit more aggressive. But I think in general this is a relatively solid team. Obviously pivoting is not bad. We got a couple of decent U-turners, a couple of decent Volt Switchers to be able to pass into. Baton Pass is obviously primarily going to be on Diancie if it's going to be anywhere. I don't think Dunsparce is ever running it. But we do have a lot of interesting mons. There's a bunch of Pokemon that get knockoff, which is super aggressive. Obviously, getting rid of items is very powerful. Terra Captain-wise, Decidueye at 9 points, with Grass, Flying, and Water Terrors. I think is super interesting. Flying may not have been my pick, personally, but I do think grass and water are decent enough. I think in most cases you're probably terra grassing this. But I don't know. Well, it'd be very interesting to see how this terra plays out. Dunsparce, obviously with normal fairy and ghost, is pretty much what MV did with the Dunsparce in BPL, so not too surprised to see that. And Oranguru, Psychic, Dark, and Steel makes a lot of sense, especially if you want to run a Trick Room option. Which, to be honest, Trick Room is kind of viable with this team, particularly with like anything Goodra pace and slower. Like, Goodra, Donphan is fine under Trick Room, it can actually be aggressive under there, and obviously Dunsparce if you really want to try to set up a Curse Glass Sweep with Dunsparce, I guess you could do that. But yeah, I definitely think this team is very strong both in and out of Sun. It's just going to be the only thing that's going to be interesting to see is how does Clockwork pilot this team, what sort of options does he choose for each matchup. I think that's going to be the important thing, is like, does Sun come to the game or not? That's going to be the interesting dilemma for Clockwork, but I think this team is super fascinating. Next up, we have Rid Gaming and the Glasgow Quagsires. This team I want to love, but there's a couple of problems that I see with it that may be a little bit of an issue. Ogerpon is a phenomenal first pick, by the way. This thing with Mold Breaker and Ivy Cudgel is going to be nasty. In the right setup, I think this has got so much potential to be very aggressive, and pairing that up with Roaring Moon and Goldango is absolutely absurd. Roaring Moon is already a big threat on its own. Thank God it can't Terra, because if this thing could Terra, break the league. Goldango with Good as Gold is very good against status moves. And not to mention it's actually a relatively solid Pokemon in its own right. This team's got bags of pace, which is one thing that's very noticeable about it, which is nice to see. It's good to see a very pacey team, because then at this point you're only really worried about webs and Trick Room. That's kind of going to be the main thing to worry about, but Goldango definitely is very aggressive as a special attacker. Ogerpon and Roaring Moon are great physical attackers. So it's a really strong offensive core to build your team around. Mew is very versatile. Obviously, everybody knows what Mew does, but there's a problem with Mew, which we'll get to in a sec. Acrobeat Tauros is a pretty interesting pick. Obviously, it's the slowest of the Tauros breed. But it still hits very, very hard. I'm definitely excited to see it get used. It's an Intimidator, which is always very nice. Electrode obviously offers a lot of pace. Kind of weak offensively, but is very, very fast. Which could definitely provide a decent speedy pivot. Obviously, Static for spreading paralysis is always very nice. Syringe was an interesting pickup because it was kind of amusing because there was Ursaluna on this team originally. And then later on in the draft, Rid drafted Ursaring and everybody was like, what? But now I see why he did, because he made a couple of changes to bring in, I believe it was Mew and Torrentee that was brought in. I'm actually just going to double check that. Let me have a look at the transactions. What did Rid change? Dropped Golem, Ursaluna, and Azelf, and brought Mew and Tornadius Therian in. Yeah, so Mew and Torn came in, which limits him down to 10 Pokemon. Which is kind of an interesting choice, but it's 10 more interesting Pokemon. But the picks are a little bit unfortunate for me. Pheasantipity, I'm not really sure what this does. I know it's relatively quick at 99 speed, and it's got really good special bulk, but as a poison fairy type, I think it's worse than Galarian Weezing. And I was having a look at what sort of utility this thing gets. It does get speed control with Icy Wind, which is nice. It gets decent Dazzling Gleam for Toxic Chain, but you're probably just going to run Moonblast because we're in singles and not doubles. I don't really think this pick works, if I'm being honest. And the main reason I don't think it works is it just doesn't offer enough. I guess it's designed to be for utility reasons why it is on the team. But I'll be honest, I kind of like Weezing more. And the main reason I like Weezing more is if we look at the removal, both Torrentee and Mew no longer get Defog. That's something to bear in mind. So not having Defog anymore on either of these means the only removal on the team is Rapid Spin and Defog on Cryogonal. And to be honest, you're probably not going to want to bring Cryogonal to every game. It doesn't necessarily fit that well. Obviously, it's great speed and great SPDF. So I'm a little bit unsure what Fezandipiti is doing on the team. I would probably put Weezing on this team, but the only way you'd be able to do that is add an extra point. Because Weezing is 12 points and Fezandipiti is only 11. But Weezing gives you Toxic Spikes, which only Mew has, at the moment, as well. So, as well as the Grounded Poison, which is what Fezandipiti is here for. So I would probably drop Taunt for like a 16-point mon. I'm actually curious what else is up for 16 points that might be a consideration. Just so I've got a suggestion. There's Kommo and Mamoswine that are up for 16 points at the moment. You know what? This team doesn't have a ground type. So I think Mamoswine might actually be worth picking up here. It would obviously lose a little bit of pace because Taunty is 121 speed with Regenerator. But if I was Rid, I would probably drop Taunty for Mamo. Mamo gives you an extra rocker as well, which currently only Mew has. I think Mamo would be a really strong option for this team. So if it was me, I would probably consider removing Fezandipiti and Taunty for Weezing and Mamoswine. It would slow you down ever so slightly, but it would give you a bit more agency, which I think would be really, really useful for this team. That would probably be what I would do to change it, but otherwise I really like this team. There's not too much in the way of Volt Switching Pivot. Obviously, Mew and Electro get it. There's decent U-turn options, which is really nice. Obviously, a lot of these effects are going to be Mew, because Mew gets everything that can be learned by TM. But yeah, I'm interested to see how this team works out, but for me, I think there's a couple of picks that I probably would consider changing if it was me. Right, next up, we have got... I've just completely blanked. Muskrat, that's the name. Banzai Muskrat and the Boston Celebis. This is a really powerful team. But by powerful, I mean, like, it's a really stally team. This is a powerful stall team with a lot of pivots. It feels like the goal with this team is to enable Ogerpon, Sneasler, and Chi-Yu to be as aggressive as possible. Which makes a bunch of sense. Like, Sneasler is fast, that Diaclaw is very, very obnoxious. It could be very problematic to deal with. Especially if you can unburden it. There's obviously a lot of Fling Big Nugget shenanigans, hence curse you Envy for bringing that to light. But yeah, with Sneasler, Fling Big Nugget Unburden makes this thing blisteringly fast. Diaclaw to spread status everywhere. Can be pretty nasty. Chi-Yu is a great tactical nuke thanks to Beads of Ruin and a really, really high special attack stat at 135. Means this can really start putting a bunch of hurting on this team. Things to kind of consider. Obviously, there's a bunch of U-turn. There's some good Wish Pass. The removal is a little bit limited. You are sort of limited to Mandibuzz for Defog, Cyclizar for Spin, or Bouncing from Hatterene. But I think all of those are really good options. I think all of them offer good value. Cyclizar as a Terra Captain is a good choice. Dragon Steel and Ghost are good options. I can see why the Steel is there. Obviously, it allows it to hit back against Fairy types. Ghost is interesting as well to not get faked out. And also to kind of not get obliterated by an Eyelib. Makes a bunch of sense. Obviously, gets Rapid Spin, gets a U-turn for pivoting with access to Regenerator. Definitely helps it out a lot. I'm interested to see how Ogerpon Cornerstone performs. Obviously, everyone sees it as the weakest one. But it's a really good grass type on this team. You know, with things like Chi-Yu, Vaporeon, and Ogerpon, you got a strong Fire Water Grass core here. The Fairy Dragon Steel, somewhat lacking, with Tinkaton being both Fairy and Steel, but more utility-based, and Cyclizar obviously being a relatively low-tier dragon. It's not a bad Pokemon, but it's only really got speed and utility. That's pretty much it. 95 attack just doesn't really cut it. To me, but I do think this team is going to be very tricky to break down. There's a lot of defensive cores that are very, very scary here. Obviously, Hippo bringing Sand and Overcoat on Mandibuzz can be quite tricky to break down. So it's going to be interesting to see how this team plays out. There's a lot of utility, a decent amount of pivot to play with. I think this team could be very, very difficult to deal with. It's very powerfully bulky, especially on the special side. So yeah, I'm definitely excited to play this team. We'll see how that one goes. But it is definitely a slower pace. Well, not slower pace, it's actually average pace, slightly quicker than me, but it'll be interesting. It's more bulk than damage. Alright, next up is Arctic Force and Inteleon Milan. This team is very, very out there. It's very, very physically very nasty, especially not as much. Obviously, Great Tusk first pick is exceptional. I think it's easily the best rapid spinner in the game. It's got great bulk, particularly on the physical side, less so on the special side, but it's a great bulky spinner, which is very, very difficult. It gets Ice Spinner as well, gets access to Stealth Rocks, so it can be a very, very scary mon. On the whole, Slowking is a brilliant bulky water, gets access to Regenerator, which I think is really interesting. And to play with, can be a little bit easily worn down, but having a good bulky water with Regenerator and a decent pivot is nice. This thing does get access to Teleport, so I could definitely see that getting used a fair bit. Ogerpon Tail Mask is Sleeper, with access to Defiant and the ability to pick its own item. This thing can be very, very scary. I'm definitely not looking forward to facing it, if I'm being very honest. But yeah, it'll be a fun matchup to deal with. Killer Wattrel is a demon as a Terra Captain. I think this thing can do so much work. With Volt Absorb and Competitive as good abilities, Wind Power is kind of bad, unfortunately. It's not an ability I have too much faith in. But yeah, Volt Absorb and Competitive, really strong, and making it Flying, Water, and Ground is really, really cool choices. Terra Water is probably my favorite pick here for a Terra Captain choice. Because Terra Water with Volt Absorb means they're essentially only weak to Grass and Freeze Dry. And not many things get Freeze Dry, and obviously Grass types you wouldn't necessarily want to switch in on a Killer Wattrel, because it still does a ton of damage to Grass types anyway, so I think it's a really inspired choice for a Terra Captain. Hydreigon, we all know what Hydreigon does. It's a pretty well-rounded, versatile mon. It can be physical, special. It did lose Defog, however, this generation. So it has a little bit less utility, but it's still got U-turn, still can pivot, and still does decent amount offensively. And again, it's a Levitate mon, which helps a little bit, especially to deal with things like Hisuian Typhlosion and Golem, which are both ground weak. Sylveon is a great fairy choice. Sylveon obviously is decent special bulk, gets things like Calm Mind. It does get Stored Power this generation, which we might see that to deal with poison types. It did lose Mystical Fire, however, and unfortunately Sylveon cannot Terra, so you can't Terra Fire or anything like that. But Pixelate Hyper Voice is still very scary. Scizor is a decent bulky pivot. I believe it lost Defog and Roost, however, which means that the only actual removal on this team is Rapid Spin Great Tusk, which is not ideal. But still a solid bullet punch hitter, especially with Technician. Can do a decent amount of work, only being weak to fire, so can be interesting. Weezing, of course, solid grounded poison type unless you run Levitate on it. Does get Toxic Spikes, which is nice. Solid option, decent move pool, decent bulk on the physical side. Could be an attractive option, does get Flamethrower to be able to hit through steel types as well. Hisuian Typhlosion, certainly the better of the two Typhlosions. Getting access to Frisk is always nice. Blaze is probably just fine, though, to be honest. This is a Terra Captain, and it's Fire, Fairy, and Grass. I think Terra Fire is very strong, especially when you pair that up with Infernal Parade, which is very, very powerful in its own right. Fairy was a surprising choice to me. I guess it's to defensively terror against Dark types. Although, to be honest, this team actually does kind of well into Dark types with close combat on Great Tusk. Sylveon does well into Dark types, so I'm not quite sure he should be that worried about Dark, if I'm being honest, but it's there anyway. And obviously Terra Grass to prevent being slept and to resist water, which is perfectly decent. Golem I have very little faith in, I have to be honest. It's a rock setter with sturdy, but it just dies. It's not that great a Pokemon in my opinion. It's insane physically, but the quad weaknesses just ruin it. And where it is an Intimidate option for 2 points, definitely worth picking up. Could be a Grass immunity as well, which could be a nice sort of pivot away from Great Tusk and Slowking. I can see where this fits in quite nicely, as well as pivot away from Golem if it ever comes to a game. I could see it. Weird is not a bad Pokemon in my opinion, and for 2 points it's definitely worth picking up. This team is very, very interesting. It's got some very obvious key components, things like the Great Tusk, the Slowking, the Ogerpon. Killer Wattrel will probably come to most games. Hydreigon is a solid option. And then it's kind of like between, do I need Typhlosion, do I need Scizor and Sylveon? the main concern really is lack of removal, with Rapid Spin, Great Tusk being the only thing, so you're kind of forced to run Boots on a lot of Pokemon, which may not be ideal. You could get worn down by Spikes, T-Spikes, and everything like that if you don't have it. But there's decent amount of pivots. Wish Passing from Sylveon is always a nice option too, so I think this could work as a solid team. But my big concern, realistically, is going to be obviously dealing with removal. But I do think this team might get a little bit same team every week syndrome. Alright, so next up we have got Pokemon Master 3056 and his New York Garbodors. This team went through so many changes from like the original planned draft into various things. Pokemon Master was very vocal in the Discord server about all of the different sort of iterations. He also did his own draft breakdown as well, which was super interesting to watch and to kind of gauge his thought process. I like the idea behind this comp. I think the comp's got a really solid Regenerator core and Amoonguss and Alomomola. And Skeledirge is a solid fire type to pair with those. Skeledirge obviously offers a decent amount offensively with decent natural bulk. Obviously slightly slow, but that's totally okay. This team does have a distinct issue with hazards. In the sense that it doesn't really have any to start with. It only has 2 rockers in Probopass and Kingambit. I don't see Probopass really being all that useful anyway. And Kingambit pretty much never runs rocks. So definitely an interesting option. This team is somewhat slow outside of Iron Bundle, Noivern, and Gyarados. And yeah, okay, Grafaii's got really good speed, but it's not offering a lot in terms of damage. It's more of a utility choice to bring forward. But this team has a lack of hazards, and it also has a lack of removal as well. In fact, I think Noivern doesn't even get Defog anymore. I'm just going to double check that, because I know a lot of Pokemon lost it. So I'm just going to check if it does still get Defog. It does, actually. So Noivern does still have Defog. So your only removal is Defog Noivern and Rapid Spin Kamala. And I don't necessarily see Kamala coming to a lot of games because Ursaluna Blood Moon exists. And Noivern will probably have to bring Defog in order to remove hazards, unless you want to run heavy-duty boots on a lot of Pokemon. Which I don't know if you really want to. Amoonguss benefits from having things like Leftovers or Black Sludge. Alomomola benefits from having Recovery, albeit it does have Wish of its own. Iron Bundle is a simple enough Pokemon. It clicks Hydro Pump, it clicks Freeze Dry, it's fast. It's very specially frail, however, so you can abuse that. But yeah, the main things for me to consider are sort of Gyarados and Noivern both having access to Tailwind. Is probably what's going to enable this team. But I do worry that this team will get punished by like very aggressive teams. And I don't think Amoonguss Alomomola as a Regenerator core is going to be enough to be able to stop that with the lack of hazards on this team. I think that's the only thing I would change, is to maybe build some opposing or alternative Pokemon around this to give you extra hazards. Because hazards really force your opponents to run boots, whereas this team kind of doesn't do that. This team doesn't have hazards to really use. It doesn't have webs. There's no web setter. It has no spikes or T-spikes. It's only got 2 rockers, and I don't think either of them really want to run rocks. That's probably my biggest concern with this team. I do like this team's offensive power, though, with Bundle, Ursaluna, Kingambit. This could actually be a really good Trick Room team, but there's one problem with that, is there's no Trick Room on this team either, so I don't know. It feels like the idea was sound, but I feel like it may perhaps not be as executed as well as he might like. Like, I think get a Trick Room setter or get extra hazards. I think this team can work. But I'm very interested to see how it goes. Terra Captain-wise, Alomomola has Water, Fairy, and Dragon. I would change Dragon to Grass if it was me. The reason why is Alomomola does nothing when it's asleep. And there's a few Pokemon out there that can put you to sleep. That could be problematic for Alomomola, and obviously, yes, hydration's a thing with Rain Dance, but who's running Rain Dance on this comp? Probably nobody. So yeah, I think this team just needs a little bit of tweaking. But I think in general throughout the season, get some hazards in, maybe get an extra remover. Perhaps a spinner would be nice. Maybe an extra defogger. There's probably a couple out there. I haven't fully looked at the board yet. But I do think a lack of hazards and a lack of removal may be the problem. This team's got really great pivots, though. That's one thing to say for it. With Bundle, Noivern getting U-turn, Gyarados getting U-turn, Kamala also gets U-turn. We got a bunch of U-turns. We have a Volt Switcher in Probopass, but again, I don't see Probopass really come into a game. Personally, it might. I might be surprised. Obviously, Wish Passing with Alomomola is a thing. Grafaiai gets Baton Pass and Parting Shot, which are decent. But yeah, I think this is like an odd Tailwind offensive team that kind of wants to play stall, but doesn't really want to play stall because it knows it's going to get run over by the offensive teams. This team's kind of missing a full identity in a way. I do like the idea of where this draft went, and I believe this is Pokemon Master's first ever draft. And for a first draft, this is not bad. This has got some really interesting Pokemon to run in. So I'm definitely excited to see what he does with this. But I do think throughout the season, there may be a couple of changes needed. Alright, next up, we have got Awesomeness Guy and his Orlando Bulbasaurs. This is very Trick Room heavy. This is very, very Trick Room heavy. And I have my own gripes with Trick Room and Draft. I feel like it's not as viable. Unfortunately, mainly because we don't have a Pokemon that immediately sets up Trick Room on switching. So this team could be interesting, but it does have a decent out of Trick Room core. One thing that's worth noting is Ninetales, Alola, Quaquaval, Volcarona, and Beartic and Dragonite all function very well out of Trick Room. So that's potentially the main crux of this comp. But obviously, Galarian Slowking getting Chilly Reception, which it is a decent alternative to Ninetales' Snow Warning, could set up Beartic for success. But outside of that, you're looking at Trick Room on Slowking, Trick Room on Bronzong, and Trick Room on Sinistcha, which are decent enough options. Now, unfortunately, at the time of recording this, I believe Awesomeness Guy has not submitted his Terra Captains yet. But my prediction for Terra Captains would be Bronzong, Knacklestack, and Beartic. Bronzong with Heat Proof and Terra Fire is pretty interesting. It can definitely offer a decent amount. It's a decent rock setter as well. Rock's Trick Room, Body Press, things like that could be good. It's between Bronzong and Sinistcha for like the 9-point mon it gets choosing. I don't think Umbreon would ever Terra. I don't think Umbreon ever needs to Terra, to be honest with you. And then Knacklestack and Beartic. Knacklestack, I don't really know what I would choose. Rocket has to have. Maybe Grass would be interesting to run on it, and potentially something like Ghost would also work. And Beartic with Ice, Water, and Fairy would be very, very strong as a Hellsweeper. But yeah, in terms of the actual team, what it offers, pivoting-wise, it only has U-turn in Volcarona and Quaquaval. I don't think Volcarona's ever running U-turn. If I'm being perfectly honest, it's mainly Quiver Dance, 3 attacks, offensive set. Also worth noting that both Volcarona and I believe Dragonite also lost Defog as well. I am just going to double-check that because I can never remember. So many Pokemon it has. Whoops. Has and hasn't lost Defog that I'm not quite sure. Quite off the top of my head. Let me just quickly have a look. Dragonite. Let me just check it has Defog or not. It does not. So it not having Defog is a little bit of a bind. Which basically means both Volcarona and Dragonite do not have Defog, so Rapid Spin Quaquaval is the only hazard removal. So much like Pokemon Masters team, where there's a distinct lack of good removal, as well as Rids and other teams, this team is lacking removal, which could be an issue. We've got 3 decent Stealth Rockers. No Spikes, sadly. Toxic Spikes and Slowking Galar is fine. There's also a distinct lack of pivots. You know, we've got 2 U-turners, one's probably never running it. No Volt Switchers. We do have Wish Baton Pass from Umbreon. That's probably the only Baton Pass user. Quaquaval can't boast Baton Pass stat boosts, obviously. So I think this team went to commit to Trick Room. And I don't know. It's half Trick Room, which I don't think is necessarily viable, and half, like, hail or, like, snow as it is now, which could be interesting. I think this team could work, but it's very, very rare. This would work well into the faster teams that can't necessarily knock out the Trick Room setters. But yeah, I think this team is going to struggle. This is probably the team I'm least scared of facing if I have to play against it. Alright, next up, we have got Derek, the commissioner of the league, and the... what's his team name? I've completely just blanked on his team name. It's the Kansas City Shuckles. That's his team. This team is very interesting, actually. This team ended very well, just as well it started. Iron Shreds is a fantastic spinner, probably one of the best spinners in the game, minus Great Tusk. It's very fast, hits very, very hard, gets a decent amount of coverage moves as well. It's a good rocker, too, to be fair. Rocks, Rapid Spin, Ice Spinner, very solid. Enamorous is very quick as well. Both 106 speed, funnily enough. Enamorous is an insane special cleaner. Could also be a Carmine Sweeper as well. Gets a good amount of coverage moves. Limora is a great hazard setter, gets rocks, gets spikes, can set up toxic spikes or use toxic debris and set it up without the need for toxic spikes. Offers a lot offensively too, things like Sludge Bomb do a ton of damage, Earth Power is there as well. Mortal Spin's a good move. It's a relatively spammable move to spread poison, and you can actually use Corrosion if you wanted to as well, so the poison and steel types can also get hit with it. Gudra is a phenomenal special dragon type. I think this Fairy Dragon Steel Core is very, very powerful. Particularly with Iron Shreds and Enamorous being more offensive, Gudra being more bulky, Gudra getting acid armor as well as body press means that, you know, yes, okay, it's 70 base defense, which is usually pretty bad, could actually suddenly start being very useful. Dozo, I've never really used it in singles. I don't know too much about what it does, but having Unaware could be really interesting. Now, the one thing that is a little unfortunate is obviously it can't Terra Grass, which may be the downside to it. But nonetheless, it can be Curse, Rest Talk, Wave Crash, and Earthquake's pretty much the only moves you ever need to run on it offensively anyway. So this thing could really put in work. It could be like a good curse set. But I don't know. I don't know much about it. I'm excited to see how Derek uses it. Electros is a great pick for low tier. It's an electric type that's immune to ground thanks to Levitate, meaning it doesn't have any weaknesses. He made it a Terra Captain. He pretty much didn't really have a choice, realistically, with the Terra Captains he had with the Pokemon he's got. But Electric, Fighting, and Ice are pretty interesting choices for Terra types. I think you pretty much only ever need Electric, to be honest. Fighting is good for Drain Punch, but I don't really see that getting used all that much. Ice is interesting because you can allow it to punish the ground types. It does get Ice Punch anyways, so I could definitely see that being a thing. But it's a versatile mon. It's a great pivot. Gets access to Volt Switch and U-Turn. So it could be very, very strong. Also gets knockoff. So it's a very spammable utility mon as a whole. Screamtail is fast utility, which I like. This one mon was actually on my radar for a while. But ultimately, obviously my only fairy that was ever fully considered was ever going to be Ribombee. But Screamtail speedy utility Encore is a pain in the ass to deal with. It can Wish Pass as well with a really good HP stat. So yeah, this thing's going to be a nightmare and annoying thing to deal with. Shaman, of course, extremely bulky. For 9 points, it's 1,000,000% worth it. Gets a myriad of coverage moves. Unfortunately, it's not allowed to Terra. If Shaman was allowed to Terra, this team would be busted. Cinderace is solid. This team doesn't have removal outside of Rapid Spin, so on Iron Shreds. So having Court Change Cinderace is the only other option, which is fine. Cinderace does a lot of damage. It's also very quick. So definitely a worthy option. Libero did get nerfed, so you can only use it once per switch in now, which is very annoying, but it's fine either way. But yeah, Pyro Ball still is going to do most of the work. It gets coverage moves like High Jump Kick and stuff like that, so it can definitely do a ton of work. Alolan Golem, much like its regular form, I don't have that much faith in, but Terra Electric Galvanized Explosion could be pretty fun. I'm sure that's probably going to come to a match. Ground is okay as a Terra type for this. Obviously allowing it to be immune to electric, etc. and removes some of its weaknesses, and flying just removes that ground weakness entirely. which is pretty interesting. Can run Magnapole to trap Steel types, but there are certain Steel types it doesn't want to trap in, so I'll be interested to see if that ever gets used. But yeah, I think this team is a little top-heavy. I do think most of the week, or most weeks, it's going to be Iron Treads and Amorous, Cinderace, pretty much has to come. And then afterwards, you're probably going to see like Shaman, Glamora, and either like Goodra or Dozo. Maybe Electros, every so often. But yeah, I think this team may get a little bit samey. So that'll be something that we might have to consider. But I do think, considering this team only has 10 Pokemon, out of the possible 12 that it could draft, there are enough good options here that it may not be like Same 6 Syndrome. So it'll be interesting to see what Derek does to pilot this. I'm excited to see how it goes. It's a very, very solid team. I think the only criticism I could really come up with is potentially it's lacking Special Bulk, but I think that's really mitigated by the fact that Goodra's got an insane amount of Special Bulk, as has Screamtail, so it could be interesting. Obviously, hazard-wise, I did point to the lack of removal, and the primary amount of hazards is going to be on Glamora. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating comp. It's very straightforward too. Like, Enamorous comes in, clicks buttons. You know, Dozo comes in, tanks a hit. Goodra comes in, tanks a hit. Yeah, it's a very simple team to pilot, but sometimes simple is the best way forward, in my opinion. And last but by no means least, he was back on the back wheel pick, and that is DJ Snore and the Quincy Klawfs. Another very vocal personality, another new face into the league, much like myself. Really fascinating team. Really fascinating team that was picked up. The first thing that really drew my attention throughout the draft was the Garchomp, Samurott, Gardevoir, and Infernape. I think this in general, the Fire, Water, Grass, Fairy, Dragon, Steel cores are really, really strong. Garchomp's obviously had its fall from Grace and Ladder. It's fallen down to UU. But it's still a relatively pacey, really strong physical attacker. Can also be bulky Rocky Helmet with things like Stealth Rock and stuff like that. Does also get spikes, which is nice too. So that can be very strong. I like the Fairy Dragon Steel core. It's a very classic sort of Gen 4 Gen 4 core with Garchomp, Gardevoir, and Magnezone. Gardevoir obviously lacking a little bit of pace, but it makes up for that with damage output and decent special bulk. And also Synchronize is an underrated ability too. You can also trace your opponent's really good abilities, but I think Synchronize may be more common just to spread like Toxic or Burn around. But yeah, I think Gardevoir's fascinating. Does get Wish, but does not get Baton Pass, unfortunately. So that's one thing to note. But yeah, we do have some interesting options. Obviously, Samurott, being able to set up spikes with its move, Ceaseless Edge, is really decent. Samurott's got good bulk as well, so it can actually switch in on just about a lot of things. Infernape is a fast, versatile fire type, can be physical special, gets rocks, gets U-turn, which pairs up with Magnezone's Volt Switch really well. So we've got a decent Volt Turn core. Bolivar's a very underrated grass type. Insane special bulk, really decent physical bulk, and a really strong special attack stat. And allowing this thing to Terra is really strong. It does get Seed Soul, which sets up grassy terrain, which is very nice to help the longevity of this team. And being able to Terra to Grass, Water, or Fairy are all really good Terra choices. I think those are my favorite Terra choices of the ones that he's chosen. Grass obviously mitigates the fire issue, also wipes away the fighting weakness. Water is a solid defensive type. Yeah, Water dealing with the fire issue, I misspoke there. Grass just elevating its already solid Grass type move pool and things like Energy Ball, Giga Drain. And Fairy, just to deal with Poison, is a good defensive Terra choice as well. Does get access to Earth Power as well to be able to deal with Poisons. But yeah, this thing can be bulky, this thing can be offensive, and can really start causing problems. Iron Jugulus is solid, good offensive mon, decent offensive pressure in general. Hisuian Zoroark does change the way people have to play because, you know, how obviously at any point in time any Pokemon can be Zoroark, which could be a little bit tricky to deal with. Zoroark, of course, getting U-turn on its own as well, which is very, very nice. I think this team ended up coming out pretty nicely. The only things that are kind of missing is removal. The only removal on this team is Rapid Spin Avalugg. There's no Defogger. There's no, like, Magic Bouncer either. So this team could suffer a bit to hazards. It does force Avalugg to run boots. Maybe a couple of other Pokemon that don't particularly want to get hazards thrown at them will probably have to run boots, which will be a little bit unfortunate, to be honest. But I do think this team has enough to sort of play around it. The other thing, really, the other Terra choice is Bruxish. Decent offensive mon. It's actually not as bad as people think it is. Does get access to Dazzling to prevent priority moves, so it can't be revenge code very easily, which could be nice. Giving it access to Water, Fire, and Fighting for a Terra type. Maybe would have gone Fairy over Fighting myself, but I think either way you're dealing with Dark types, which is what Bruxish doesn't want to deal with. So I can see it. Strongjaw has got a lot of biting moves, so that could also be a thing too. And Klawf is his mascot, so I'm really not surprised to see Klawf getting picked up. I know throughout the draft he was memeing a lot about getting it, because originally I think Red had already took Golem, which was the potential replacement, and then Golem got dropped. So there was a lot of like shenanigans going on between him and Pokemon Master trying to get Klawf on the team. So that was pretty funny. Definitely fun to watch. But Klawf is interesting with Regenerator and Anger Shell and Shell Armor, all really solid abilities. I could see Klawf putting in some work, especially in the hands of the person whose mascot it is. Rock, Fire, and Fairy are interesting Terra choices, especially Fire dealing with Steel types, which Klawf doesn't want to deal with. Downside is it's still weak to ground. And Water. And Fairy is nice to deal with Steels. Well, Fairy is nice to actually deal with that, but the problem is it doesn't deal with Steel. The one pick that I would like to see him change is Arbok. Arbok's a 2-point Pokemon. Yes, it has Intimidate, which is fine, and it's a grounded poison type. But sitting in 4 points right now that has been undrafted is Cantonian Muck. Cantonian Muck does what Arbok does, but better. Right? It's a grounded poison type. It's got better defense, better stats, less of a wide move pool, but like Arbok's stats are abysmal. Like, it doesn't offer enough in the team to me. Muck gives you a Toxic Spiker, which you currently don't have. I think that's what I would do. Use those extra 2 points, drop Arbok, bring Muck into the team, and I think this team gets a slight upgrade from there. But yeah, this team's good offensively. Really good offenses. I do just worry that the hazards may be the biggest problem. But yeah, that's my thoughts on all of the drafts. In terms of like matchups for myself, matchups that I'm excited for, I'm definitely excited to take on Teddy's team. This is going to be a really fun team to fight. I think Mate's team could be very interesting to fight. Definitely curious to see how that goes. Rid's team started out really well, so I'm definitely interested to see how he plays. But yeah, looking through, this Pokemon Masters team is going to be fun to fight. It's going to be slow, but I'll be able to deal with it primarily. Obviously facing Trick Room is always interesting, in my opinion. But yeah, I think the main challenges for me this season certainly are going to be Teddy's team is going to be very strong. I think Jay's team could be annoying to deal with, but I think I have enough answers for it. Main team I have a fairly positive matchup into, in my opinion. This Sun team is going to be nasty. Clockwork's team is pretty difficult to prep for. I can see that coming from a mile away. Banzai Muskrat's team, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what it can do. I think it's got some potential. I'm hoping I can break it, because it's definitely a relatively stalling matchup. Inter Milan, I think this team has legs. It's got enough to be able to work with, but I think I can match up into that positively as well. I think I have a positive matchup into the New York Garbodors, but that one maybe proved me wrong with the Regenerator Core. Trick Room, I think I beat, no problem. Derek's team, yeah, it's going to be a massive, like, battle of wills. It's going to be a sheer hit them in the face fest. So that matchup is going to be fun to play. And then I think this team, yeah, I can see myself struggling against this team initially, but I think I might have just about enough to be able to deal with it. But yeah, those are my thoughts on all of the opposing coaches. Let me know what you think about their teams down below. Of course, who do you think is going to be the toughest matchup for me? My vote is going to be Teddy. I think this team is just nasty. But that's my opinion either way. I'd love to hear what yours is. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name is Ribombee Teacher. I'm your coach of the Royal Bournemouth Ribombees. Stay safe, stay awesome. I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.